Welcome to Clarity Fund Podcast. This is Dr. Owen Anderson, and I'm continuing my series on the death of the academy. What happens when the academy no longer provides meaning? So you can revisit earlier episodes to, if you haven't heard them, to get caught up with what is this idea of death in the academy. And last time we started thinking about particular disciplines and talk about the death of theology. And for some reasons, that might be more familiar. People might say, yeah, I kind of understand that, the death of God. So if God is dead, then theology is dead, right? So you might want to revisit that one also. Here we're going to continue that theme, looking at particular disciplines by looking at the death of the humanities. And you might say, well, wait a minute, that's not fair. That's not a particular discipline. That's a whole series of disciplines like philosophy and history and literature. And that's true. So I may go back and look at those particular disciplines. And here we are looking at that umbrella of the humanities. And what would it mean for the humanities to be dead? Well, in order for them to be dead, they'd be no longer achieving their purpose. They'd be no longer functioning in the way that they're supposed to function. And so what's the purpose of the humanities? In order to answer that question, I visited a number of university web pages. Notable university web pages, universities that no one would doubt. These are solid universities, and you'd want to go there or want your kids to go there. And I visited them to see, do they say anything about what the humanities are? And I got kind of a general consensus. They all overlapped in what the humanities are and how to try to attract students to the humanities. And a common theme was that the humanities ask all kinds of questions about human life. I mean, in one way, the humanities are unlimited because you're asking about everything that humans interact with, everything that affects human life. So in one way, you can do humanities and study science. You may not be studying it directly and doing science, but you're studying the human activity of science, a history of science, or the intellectual history of science, the philosophy of science. So everything falls underneath the humanities and is an object of wonder. That was another common theme. Trying to attract students by saying, whatever you're interested in, you can come here and you can pursue. Another part that came out was the individuality of the humanities. The humanities study not just an abstract humanity, but individual human lives. It becomes kind of autobiographical. This human's perspective, and that human's perspective, and this group's perspective, and that group's perspective, and they all get put underneath the humanities. And so how can you say that's dead? That's not dead. That's full of wonder and excitement. And that's true. And that's what attracted me to the humanities. And so I don't have any disagreement with that perspective or that approach. But, and yet, however, and you say, oh, Anderson, why can't you just leave it there? Well, one of the things the humanities wanted to do was to study the meaning of things. What is the meaning of human life, of these various human activities? And so the humanities are being successful insofar as they are providing meaning. And not just the appearance of meaning, not just where you think you have meaning for a little while, and you go away thinking you have meaning, and then as it's tested, it turns out it wasn't really meaning, you only had the appearance of meaning. No, we want actual meaning, the real thing. And, however, but the humanities, one of the web pages I looked at was from Stanford, and it stood out to me. They use a specific word. The humanities provide foundational disciplines. So the humanities aren't just studies. It's not just a collection of things that interest us. It's doing foundational work, and it was good to see Stanford affirming that. But if we've gone this far in the humanities, hundreds and thousands of years, let's say we date them back to the earliest human endeavors, and it's thousands of years, and we haven't yet found the true things at the foundational level, then we haven't succeeded. And what on earth would make us think we'd be able to succeed next? And I don't think that's actually how it's approached. I think it's approached this way. People will say, that never was our point. We never were going to provide knowledge. We're just providing more and more descriptions of the human experience. So that's a kind of empiricist approach to the humanities. And as I said, an autobiographical approach. I tell you my perspective, you tell us your perspective, the next person says their perspective, and on and on. And there is no knowledge, there's just perspectives of things. And it all becomes man is the measure of all things. And there's just the many men or humans. That was said when they use the word man in the generic, so we can say humans. There's just humans are the measure of all things. And there's just the many different humans with their many different measurements, and there is no knowledge. Well, then, keeping consistent with our theme on the death of the academy, that's just skepticism. That's just the denial that we can know anything at all. And it's try to salvage something, some program, so we keep people in humanities employed doing something. We don't want a bunch of unemployed philosophers wandering the streets. So we keep them employed saying, well, it's just wonderful to study things, but you're not really attaining knowledge by your studies. You're just maybe attaining a kind of familiarity with other people's perspectives, and none of you knows anything. And so you haven't, in the humanities, achieved knowledge. And that will always make it hard for the humanities in the academy, because other disciplines like math and science will say, well, we're at least giving knowledge. Science, math, engineering, and technology will say, well, we're at least providing knowledge. And those guys aren't. And then some in the humanities will say, okay, well, we'll be more scientific. We'll be logical positivists, and we'll try to make the humanities more scientific. And that's not the solution. That's not what I'm suggesting. By their own, in their own method, the humanities provide foundational knowledge. Knowledge that is connected up to the nature of things, and answer basic questions facing all humans. Those basic questions are things like, how do I know? Not, what do I think I know, but how do I know? How is knowledge possible? And what is real? What is permanent? What has existed from eternity? And by way of contrast, once you know that, you'll know what isn't eternal, what is temporal and changing, what is created. And what is a good life? What is our highest good, which requires knowing what is it to be a human and what is good for a human, and how do I attain that in my unique setting? How have other people attained it in their unique setting or failed to attain it? What have been the consequences of their having failed to attain it? So you do bring in that does bring in the autobiographical approach, but even then there's this objective reality of the human good. And you hear from the autobiographical approach the person saying what they did and didn't do, and you can analyze it and look for meaning and see, well, how did they achieve meaning, or how did they fail to achieve meaning? What would it be like in my own life? So we can ask these basic questions. They're recognized as foundational questions for all of life, and that the humanities are the ones that provide those basic questions. But we aren't getting to knowledge. And as such, we aren't providing meaning. And especially comes out in that question, what is the human good? And we didn't provide meaning. And the consequence was meaninglessness. And instead of providing meaning, we might have just replaced it with studying as many possible autobiographical perspectives as possible, thinking that was knowledge when it wasn't. And so we just end up with this perspectival approach, which is a branch of the empirical approach. And empiricism always has this problem of ending up in skepticism. There's just the many different perspectives, experiences. There's nothing uniting them that we call knowledge. And so we end up in that skepticism, and we need out of it, or else the discipline dies. It ends up in meaninglessness. And the supposed wonder that we were offering doesn't materialize. And Socrates spoke about what would happen to these teachers in the Apology, at the end of the Apology, that Socrates had been somewhat gentle in pointing out that the teachers of Athens didn't have knowledge, but that after him would come these students who would rise up and they wouldn't be gentle at all. And they would point out, look, you haven't helped us get meaning. You've just been been doing skepticism. We want meaning in life. We want knowledge. That's what Socrates wanted. Knowledge. So how do we do that in the humanities? Interestingly, the humanities, maybe sometimes this is also called the liberal arts education. Liberal arts and sciences are added on there. So now I'm just focusing on the liberal arts in terms of the humanities. All right. What's a liberal arts? Well, that could have two definitions. A book education. Liberal, liber, going for book, the root word in book. And that's where you come to be familiarized with the best ideas, the most influential ideas in human history. So the most influential may not always be the true ones, but you still want to know what have been the influential ideas and what have been the best ideas, what challenges have been raised up against those ideas. And then you also, sometimes liberal arts education means a liberty education. To be liberated. Well, from what? From ignorance. Ignorance is a kind of oppressive master. You're not able to lead a good life when you're bound by ignorance. And so liberal arts education is one that frees you from ignorance. But in contemporary circles, contemporary humanities, they might say, well, a liberal education has actually just repeated the oppression problem. So you'll have something like Paulo Freire analyzing the pedagogy of the oppressed and analyzing what he calls the teacher-student contradiction. That we really need to be freed from this kind of education altogether and instead become radicalized. And so he gives some examples of what this would look like. The contradictions in education. He has a list of points, number one being the teacher teaches and the students are taught. And so the contradiction there is this idea that the teacher knows things. And that's the second point. The teacher knows everything and the students know nothing. Now, I've never met a teacher who says they know everything. They know enough to teach their students what the students don't know, and they can then come to know about the subject, whatever the subject is. And there's lots of classes with lots of different things to be taught. But think about that first point. The teacher teaches and the students are taught. It's affirming that to be a teacher means you know some things. And to be a student means you don't know those same things and you want to know them. And so this very first point in this list on the pedagogy of the oppressed is wrong because he's suggesting we don't know things or everyone knows things in the same way because knowledge is just by experience. And I have my perspective and you have your perspective and there's just these many different experiences. And so the idea that you'll teach me presumes you overstep your bounds. You don't know me. You don't know my perspective. You can't teach me. All of us teach. So the teacher knows everything. The students know nothing. And the third one is the teacher thinks and the students are thought about. Or the fourth one, the teacher talks and the students listen meekly. Or the fifth one, the teacher disciplines and the students are disciplined. Next, the teacher chooses and enforces his choice and the students comply. So this whole idea of there being a difference between teachers and students. So let's go with this route and say, no, there's no difference between teachers and students. They're all in the same playing field because they all just have their equal perspectives and experiences. And the teacher can learn just as much from the students, which, by the way, I've never heard a teacher deny. Every teacher I know says, I learned so much from my students, right? Many life lessons, but about the subject you're teaching them, the idea is the teacher knows things. So this begins by assuming skepticism. Knowledge is not possible. Because otherwise, the traditional view of a teacher is the teacher has attained knowledge, the students haven't. And the students need to attain that knowledge, and they do that by learning from the teacher. And there's lots of methods. He presents the teacher just as up there talking. And maybe there have been some teachers like that. They just get up there and talk for the whole class period. But there's lots of other methods teachers use to encourage different learning styles. And teachers teach. That might be better than saying teachers talk and students listen meekly. Teachers teach and students learn. That's the very definition, because by definition of what those words mean, that's what they do. But if we start with the idea that knowledge is not possible, that humans are the measure of all things, that there's just the many perspectives. You know your perspective, I know my perspective, and I can't presume to teach you, and reverse is true, you can't presume to teach me. well, then we don't actually have knowledge. And so the whole idea of teacher and student falls apart, which means the whole idea of education falls apart. And that's a consequence of knowledge. And that falling apart is death. Now, someone could say, yes, I'm glad it died. It was wrong-headed, and so I'm glad I helped bring an end to liberal arts education, an end to the humanities. But what you've done really is just you've lived out the expression of skepticism. You were a skeptic, and you lived consistently with that skepticism, which, as expressed, puts an end to any study of any kind, including the study of the humanities. So what we need to do, or what these episodes are teaching is, well, how do we learn to identify the assumptions there and critically test them for meaning? Maybe I don't want to accept this view of knowledge. Maybe I've seen the empirical assumptions, and I believe knowledge is by reason, which is the same in all humans, so all of us can arrive at knowledge, and if you arrive at knowledge by reason, you can help me arrive at that same knowledge by reason. You can teach me. So interestingly, that's what happens here. Our pedagogy is an expression of our worldview. That's true for the Socratic pedagogy. Maybe we see that come out especially in the Meno. And that's true for Paulo Freire's view of pedagogy. It's an expression of his whole worldview. If we want to accept his pedagogy, we'd have to accept his worldview. And if his worldview is incorrect, then his pedagogy will be incorrect. And the same would be true for Socrates. Or Rousseau's pedagogy, Descartes' pedagogy, in thinking about Enlightenment pedagogy. That'd be true for them as well. So what we need to do in philosophy is learn how to think. The humanities begin by teaching us foundational things, the first of which is critical thinking, meaning identifying assumptions and testing them for meaning. When we can do that, then we are equipped to assess these different pedagogies and these different worldviews on which they rest. We're equipped to analyze the many different beliefs humans have had, and not just simply hear multiple different beliefs, but also assess them. They're not all true. Some of them are true and others aren't true. And that's what we want to figure out. We're not just able to list as if we're cataloging the many different views of humans. Here's view 1, view 2, view 3, view 1 billionth. And we have this exhaustive catalog. Well, that's not what we're doing. A computer can do that. We're not only cataloging them, we're also assessing them, critically analyzing them, thinking about their meaning. And we realize that just because someone says, this had meaning for me, we know it may not have actually had meaning. It might have had temporary meaning. And we can look and see what were the consequences in that person's life. So the humanities, if the humanities are dead, it's because they've given into skepticism, to the view that knowledge is not possible. There's just the many different perspectives. And at the end of the day, the human is the measure of all things. One perspective is just as good as someone else's perspective. Or you might judge the perspectives of how they make you feel. This perspective is bad because it hurts people's feelings, but this other perspective isn't bad because it doesn't hurt people's feelings. And you start using words like that, nice and bad, instead of true and false. Or this view's false because it's bad because it hurt my feelings. And that's not what is a guide to true or false at all. So we've lost the ability to identify true and false. We've lost, even what those words mean, then that's a kind of death. Because those are basic and foundational in the humanities. And if we've lost the ability to answer foundational questions, then that's a kind of death. Now that leaves the initial challenge I brought up, and we'll close with it. Well, Anderson, look, we've been allowing you humanists for thousands of years to wrestle with these basic questions. And you're telling me you still don't have an answer. Why should we expect there to ever be an answer? Is it just a situation where hope springs eternal in the human breast? Man never is, but always to be blessed? And then that means you're kind of misguided here. You're naive, and we're not going to have to put up with you anymore. Well, that could be. It could be that we've had too much time. Maybe we've ran out of time as humanists. And we were supposed to have provided answers and we didn't. Now, I don't want to say we haven't provided answers because the humanists don't agree yet. That's not the standard. There could be lots of reasons why we haven't come to agreement yet. Coming to agreement assumes everyone involved is seeking and is using reason to seek and come to know things, and they may not be. So what our standard is, our judge is this: have we been given answers to basic questions by reason? And can those be tested by reason and argument and stand up to those tests? That will be the standard for determining, have we provided answers? And maybe we're at a time in history where that's what needs to be done. There are only so many answers. In one way, there's only two answers. There are many different expressions of those two answers. But we need to be able to identify what are the two basic beliefs about what is eternal, and let's test them for meaning. That's the stage we're at. And then from there, we can begin to build on the one of them that is correct. They both can't be true, and they both can't be false. They are these: the belief that all things are eternal in some sense, as an eternal cycle or an eternal expanse into the past. On the other hand, the belief that only some is eternal. Only God, the Creator, is eternal, and other things were created by God. The third option, which is that nothing is eternal, hasn't ever developed into a worldview. Every worldview holds one of those first two. And the humanities right now might be dominated by one of them. And if that's not the true one, then the humanities are not dominated by truth. So we need to be able to do this fundamental project. Is of this: if the humanities are fundamental to the rest of the academy, philosophy is fundamental to the humanities, because it's doing the foundational work of teaching us to think critically, to identify assumptions and test them for meaning. When philosophy is doing that, philosophy is very much alive. When it's no longer doing that, then it's in the kind of skepticism that Socrates was objecting to. Interestingly, some people think Socrates himself was a skeptic, and he may have become one, but his project in the Apology is to find knowledge. And he's objecting to those who are skeptics in the sense that they think they know, but they don't actually know. And we might find out that many people are in that place today. They think they know, but they don't have knowledge. Woe to those who think they know, but they don't know. That's a kind of death. And that's the kind of death we're talking about in this series. And it's what we want to avoid. We want to be able to identify it and suggest a cure. And no one will accept a cure if they don't think there's an ailment. So first we're identifying there is an ailment, and here's what we need to do to overcome that ailment. And we'll need to still unpack that more in future episodes. So thanks for joining me on this episode of looking at the humanities and death in the humanities. We'll see you next time.